welcome you all, both the presenter, Professor Schwarz, who I will say something about in a minute, and all of you and all those in the room, to our Migration and Displacement, Histories, Stories, and Myths lecture series, which we're continuing today. And this is the 5th lecture. And this is part of a bigger kind of project to think about how we incorporate migration, mobility, and displacement into some of the studies within the university, and whether actually a separate program is something that we should be looking at, or rather seeing it as part of other kind of programs and series like this. And I'm not doing this alone, I'm doing it with colleagues in the room, but also especially Professor Marcia Schenk and Professor Filippo Carla-Upi, and also the Roots Network at Exeter University. So the format for today, I'm just going to give a brief introduction to our speaker, and she's going to speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have about half an hour or so for questions and answers. And remember, the students, you're always going to be writing down questions, and hopefully you will feel strong enough to ask them in class, and not just afterwards. And just so far, the questions have been fantastic, so please try and ask them in class if you can. So today, Professor Schwarz will be presenting on When Are Settlers Migrants? And she's a professor of British Cultural Studies here at the University of Potsdam. And previously she directed German-Australian research groups. And I think it's important to know the times because it'll give you some background as to where the talk today is partly coming from. Memory migration, colonial entanglements, experimental histories, waste matters, and German-Australian anthropological legacies. And these were all done with other institutions, particularly at the ANU in Canberra, and also some of them funded by the DAAD, which this initiative is also funded by. She's also a founding member of the critical Habitations Network, and she coordinates the Potsdam Postcolonial Chair for Global Modernities. The current research project focuses on the figure of Tupaia, a Polynesian master navigator who joined the crew of Captain James Cook on his first voyage to the South Seas. And her recent publications include co-edited volumes on German-Australian Colonial Entanglements, Postcolonial Justice in Australia, Reassessing the Fair Go, and Postcolonial Piracy, Media Distribution, and Cultural Production in the Global South. So thank you for taking the time out to be with us today. And
thank you, Lena. And thank you for this invitation, everyone. The DAAD guest professorship is a great opportunity. I think I've said it already, to connect within the faculty around central themes. So huge thanks to Lena and to the colleagues in the history department for this opportunity to be here today and just touch base with what we're all doing and interested in. When Lena approached me in January, I was in quarantine with my family, and the reality of the semester seemed a long way away. I don't know how you remember January, but I did not think I'd actually be standing here and doing this, and I could not imagine it to be hot. So here I am hot. And also I'm a bit, for the past week or so, I've been going, oh my God, what have I done? You do these catchy titles and then you think, yeah, there's lots of time to work this out. And then the time comes and the lecture needs to be prepared. So all I knew when I gave Lena the title was that I would like to tackle the lecture series theme of migration and displacement from the perspective of its seemingly conceptual other, that is colonial settlement, right? Migration settlement. Today's lecture then is my response to the challenge I set myself in January. And let me say, I did not make it like it's not 100%. I did not meet that challenge 100%. And we're sort of at 70 maybe, just so that you know what you're in for, okay? As someone working in cultural studies in our university's English department, I have, as Lena just said, regional expertise in the South Pacific, that is Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and to some extent the Society Islands. That is the work on Tupaia that you've just mentioned. Conceptually, my research has predominantly been concerned on the one hand with social and cultural histories of post-war migration to the region and the attendant politics of multiculturalism, and on the other hand with settler colonialism and the policies and pedagogies of memory that sustain it. My approach to this lecture, therefore, would draw on both of these sort of areas that I have some knowledge about. Now, about my title, you will have noticed that it's sort of weirdly postmodern in ways that we don't want to be postmodern anymore, right, with putting things in brackets, right? But it does not simply ask, are settlers migrants? They most certainly are, right? After all, the act of colonial settlement presupposes prior migration to the place to be settled. In discussing particular moments from modern Australian history, I'm rather interested in when this fact is acknowledged and when it is rendered irrelevant. That is to say, what are the historical, political, and wider discursive conditions that render the migratory status of settlers visible or invisible? Under what circumstances does the figure of the migrant become the settler? And when and how are colonial settlers unsettled and reminded of their migratory pasts? In asking these questions, I will revisit historical sources that I know of, and I'm no historian, so that's part of me being super nervous just in front of you, all of you. I'm just going, and in front of Lena and everyone, right? So historical sources from the late 18th and mid-19th century for a critical reading of the British and to a lesser extent, what might be called the Prussian settler colonial project in Australia. There will then be a rather harsh break, just so that you know, totally I'm aware of it, a rather harsh conceptual break, and later sections of my talk will discuss Australia's reaction to undocumented arrivals, the recent ones, sometimes called boat people, of the past 2 decades. These reactions, I hope, will allow us to interrogate the ongoing imaginative labor that sustains settler colonialism's ideological structure of thought, even in fields of social debate that seem rather irrelevant to the colonial context, right? Even in discussions on refugees, I'm arguing that colonial history of Australia matters. I'll conclude with an Indigenous artistic intervention into this formation of settler colonialism. Let me begin, however, with a brief summary of how settler colonialism in my field, that is English literary cultural studies, has come to be discussed in recent years. Settler colonies, the argument goes, share a distinctive structure that hinges on a twofold operation. They're historically founded on the basis of large-scale migration from Europe. And just to give you some sort of number, approximately 48 million immigrants left Europe from the Americas, Australia, and New Zealand between 1800 and 1925 alone. This is the period when the Australian nation state, the federated nation state, was founded in 1901, right? So right in that period, 48 million immigrants leaving Europe and a significant share of them arriving in Australia. The migration was driven by the annexation of land, appropriation of raw materials, and subjugation, displacement, and sometimes genocidal elimination of indigenous populations. I would like to pause here because in German history, or in my family history, for instance, that's not how we think of these people, right? We think of them, my granddad's uncle, like that's the story goes, he left. And that's sort of where the story ends, right? He left, he's no longer one of us. He emigrated to Australia. That's a story that runs in my family. I know nothing more about that except that my granddad's uncle left. And he left for reasons, poverty or better life chances elsewhere. So if we want to go and find these histories here, we would go to places like the Emigration Museum, right? And the stories that have been told there are not about colonialism, they're about hope. Future horizons, brighter futures ahead, maybe also hardships here and then leaving for somewhere else. So that's one thing that I briefly want to pinpoint, that these histories here in Europe are somehow, they don't fit our national narratives, right? Now, scholars of settler colonialism argue that importantly, the project of settler colonialism isn't over, right? Indigenous people are still there. They did not agree for their land to be taken away, right? So even if most settler colonies have since become modern nation states, in most of these places, no treaties were signed, like Australia, no treaty. And that's why, in the words of one of the settler colonial scholars I'm sort of drawing on, Patrick Wolfe, in the words of Patrick Wolfe, settler colonizers come to stay. Invasion is a structure, not an event. That is to say, it didn't happen in the past, it's an ongoing process of trying to settle a land where other people resist that settlement. A project that is never fully achieved, just as these societies continue to disavow Indigenous peoples and their life worlds. They deny that they were there before. You must, if you want to have ownership of the land, you must go, no one here before, this was for us. And secondly, they deny that they're still here. People are still here, still saying that was wrong. So settlers, we might say, are migrants who come to stay. Migrants who in settling disavow their own migratory past, as well as the fact of previous settlement and continuing sovereignty over the land by its Indigenous population, so as to legitimate their own claims to that place. This is what makes the acknowledgement that Australia always was, always will be Aboriginal land, that we often hear at the beginning of academic conferences in Australia, not just academic, like social gatherings that are somewhat public, will begin with what we really hear, some form of this kind of acknowledgement these days. It's only a recent thing, maybe the past, 15 years or so, right? Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Followed by the recognition that sovereignty was never ceded. These are important starting points and touchstones for my talk today. What does it mean to look at European emigration and settlement from this perspective? And how much such a framing impact on how we discuss refugee migration to a place like Australia? So let's get started for the next 20, long started, I hate it when speakers do that. Right, oh my God, 10 minutes gone, she's just starting. Page 2. The next 20 minutes or so, I would like to discuss with you one very iconic historical moment from Australia's settlement, and one sort of not that many people know about, to see how historically that process of settlement was legitimized rhetorically, okay? British colonial interest in the Australian continent is often thought to begin in 1770 with Cook's first voyage, sometimes called voyage of exploration, voyage of discovery, first voyage around the world, whatever. On that voyage, Cook had been instructed by the Admiralty, that is his bosses, right, to take possession of a continent of great extent, thought to exist in the southern latitudes. The order further instructed him, with the consent of the natives, to take possession of convenient situations in the country in the name of the King of Great Britain, right? With the consent of the natives to take possession. Now, let me share with you 2 excerpts from Cook's journal of his very first days in on the Australian continent, in what will then become Australia, from almost exactly 252 years ago. I wish it was on the day, because it's almost exactly the same day, right? 29th of April, we're not that far away. So just, anyway, 252 years ago, before the pandemic, I taught a course on this. It was like 250 years ago today. That was even more fun. But anyway, 2 excerpts from 252 years ago, in which Cook, in his journal, describes his first steps on Australian soil and his first encounters with the Gadigal people in the region that will then become Sydney. So this is the first landing, right? And I'll try and read it out. Kind of person I could, but I can try to read it out for you. This is from a journal, a handwritten journal. It was not meant for publication. It's transcribed from that journal. I love this transcript because it lets us see, when he adds stuff and when he takes it away. The highlights are mine though. Okay. Sunday 29th. So as we came in on both cones of the bay, several of the natives and a few huts, men, women and children on the south shore abreast of the ship, to which place I went in the boats in hopes of speaking with them, accompanied by Mr. Banks, Dr. Solander and Tupaia. As we approached the shore, they all made off except 2 men who seemed resolved to oppose our landing. As soon as I saw this, I ordered the boats to lay up on the oars in order to speak to them, but this was to little purpose, for neither us nor Tupaia could understand one word they said. We then threw them some nails and beads and so on, ashore, which they took up and seemed not ill-pleased with, insomuch that I thought they beckoned us to come ashore, but in this we were mistaken. For as soon as we put the boat in, they again came to oppose us, upon which I fired a musket between the 2, which had no other effect than to make them retire back where bundles of their darts lay. And one of them took up a stone and threw at us, which caused my firing of a second musket load with small shot. And although some of the shots struck the man, yet it had no other effect than to make him lay hold of a shield or target to defend themselves imminently. After this, we landed, which we had no sooner done than they'd throw 2 darts at us. This obliged me to fire a 3rd shot, soon after which they both made off. Consent. Seems wasn't quite so easy to achieve. You'll note here that there's opposition, right? And he's written into this first encounter that is sort of iconic in Australian history is opposition to the landing. Note also how Cook feels he must justify the shots. He can't just shoot. I mean, we tend to think of these early encounters to be just plain violent, and they were violent, but there was still a sense that these shots needed to be justified. There needed to be reason and danger to Cook's own safety. And we might wonder, whom is Cook giving these justifications to? It's of course the Admiralty who will judge him when he returns. He must hand over the book and they read it. And we might also imagine that he might have anticipated a broader readership because that report was then to be read first by a broader European reading public. It actually became the bestseller in British libraries of its day, like the most borrowed book. I don't know, not that many books, but still. So even far away from Britain, there were norms of appropriate behavior which needed to be followed. And this, I think, was roughly appropriate, but still, anyway. The Endeavour's crew stays in what Cook was to call Botany Bay for just over 10 days. The relationships do not improve. Upon leaving the bay, right, 10 days later, Cook writes this. And again, I've taken this is a transcript of what he writes. And I would like you, if it's okay, I would like you to read it and briefly share with us sort of your observations about this. I'm happy to also say something about it, but it'd be lovely if you could take a look at it and maybe share some of your observations about this excerpt. Wait for 2 minutes, and then if no one says anything, I'll say stuff.
Can I ask you what the crossed out bits are?
So it's a transcript from the journal, and Cook is choosing his words. So he's correcting himself. So what we have here is the first moment of taking possession, right? This particular segment ends with Cook's description how the English colours are displayed, right? Flags are hoisted. And then he leaves an inscription on the shore, right? This is how this ends. It's, in that sense, an important passage in that journal because we must sort of imagine there's the Admiralty reading this. Has he taken possession of convenient situations in the country or not? Oh, yes, he has. And he's done the right thing. He left inscriptions and he hoisted the flag. So this is how it ends. We must imagine, I think, the Admiralty actually as addressee of this performance. I think local people would have gone, what on earth are they? You don't know what they make of it. But Cook needs to do this and needs to write this because possession must be taken according to certain standards. What I would like us to remark upon, though, would be maybe how that passage is prepared. What is it that he says before? Any observations? Lectures is not when you ask questions, right?
What's the question again?
Again, I guess I want us to think about this part in his journal as carefully drafted, right? He's taking possession, so that it must be done in the right way. That's what he does in the end. But preparing for that act of taking possession, he describes local people, and he describes them in a particular manner. That's sort of what I'm after. But I'm happy to keep on talking.
No, hold on a second.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting question. So you're asking, so the last bit there is the actual act of possession, the physical act of what gets carried out. So I guess part of the question is, what is it that he chooses to talk about before, and why does he do that? And maybe another way of maybe considering that is to think about, what does he seem to be surprised about or doesn't understand?
Thank you. Yeah.
Clothing, and ornaments, and he seems to concentrate anything that separates them from us. He instructs someone else, others.
So again, in front of historians, this makes me nervous, right? But late 18th century, how do you distinguish between people? We're not Darwin's, we're not thinking Darwinist terms, but you can think about, what do they wear? Do they have clothes or not? Do they wear ornaments or not? As in, do they have cultured objects or not? And he goes, no. assigning them a particular status. You also wanted to add to this.
Yes, I also found this interesting, the passage after when he crossed the words. However, we could know but very little of their customs as we never were able to form any connections with them. So it's like maybe some kind of justification again.
Yeah. That too, he should have made a connection. He's been told with the consent, so he must say it didn't work out. No one wanted to even have a conversation. And because that couldn't happen, I think that's why the other things become so important, because you couldn't ask. What could he ask? Will you give us the land? And they go, yes. And that didn't happen. So he couldn't even ask, will you give us the land? He could just sort of stand there and observe, and the observations then justify that act. And you might notice, okay, not very numerous, right? Dispersed in small parties along by the waterside. Right, so there are not many people there. They are dispersed. They don't seem to be like in the city, for instance, in some sort of bigger place, but in small places. And then what we've already heard. What I also find interesting is actually what he crosses out, because Cook's a careful guy, and he might have, I don't know why he crosses that out, because that would have given him even a better argument. He says, he wrote, at least he wanted to write, I believe that they depend upon the present day for their sustenance, right? They don't keep provisions, another marker of civilizations. Do you have a place where you keep food for worth other times? No, they don't. They are nomads. That's what he's telling us. And nomads can have connection to the country? No.
They're also silent.
Yeah.
There's nothing said about the language.
No.
There's nothing said about the speaking.
No.
So they seem to be just bodies, really.
Yeah. Okay, so none of us can know exactly what happened. I've read Cook a lot. I do trust him when he says there's no connection. I actually do think no connection for all sorts of reasons. And yet this is a carefully crafted text because it gets us to this passage of taking possession, right? He needs to legitimize it, and he does it by denying, a civilizatory status to Australia's first people and denying them settlement, right? They are dispersed. That's, I guess, what I would like us to take away from here. You may detect a similar logic. It doesn't show fully. What do we do? I'm quickly trying to correct. Oh, my beautiful preparations to not come to nothing. Let's see what happens. That will do, nevertheless, some way or another. This is Joseph Banks, who was with Cook on board the Endeavour in 1770. At the time he does this, he's Sir Joseph Banks, head of all sorts of societies in the UK. This is Sir Joseph Banks' remarks to the House of Commons in 1785. He had travelled with Cook on board the Endeavour and testified before two House of Commons committees in 1779 and 1785 when Britain was deciding on whether or not to send convict ships to Australia, a move that would then begin settlement proper. This is Banks' statement from 1785, and I wanted to highlight passages for you that I can no longer do, but you will notice, right? He says there are few inhabitants. It's being asked, are there many people? Is there going to be trouble? No, few inhabitants. They do not appear at all to be feared. We never saw more than 30 or 40 together, so very small groups of people seemingly sort of moving around in the country. And then further down in the middle, you can see this around here. Are we going to come into any trouble trying to settle there? Certainly not. From the experience I've had, I'm inclined to believe that they would speedily abandon the country to the newcomers. Okay. And then it ends. This interview ends with, a strong vote on the part of Banks for the settlement of Australia by saying it's the fertility of the soil, it's the climate, and the timid disposition of the inhabitants. They'll speedily go away, right? That sort of makes him want to suggest that place for settlement. Now, the concept of terra nullius, meaning nobody's land, refers to a legal doctrine derived from European traditions stretching back to ancient Romans, I hope. The idea was that land could be declared empty or unowned if there were no signs of sustained occupation, that is, settlements such as cultivation of the soil, towns, cities, or sacred temples. As a legal doctrine, people in Australia didn't use that. Cook and Banks didn't use those words. It wasn't used in Australia until the 1880s. Cook doesn't use that word, Banks doesn't use it, but each in their own way act by that idea. Okay? So what is important within the context of these lectures is this curious confusion of categories, such as settlement and migration, that we can observe. Settler colonialism imagines the land as awaiting migrants from Europe, migrants who understand themselves to be settlers. At the same time, it assigns a particular migratory status to the people who were there first, right? Their right to prior occupation is denied, if you like. They're rendered as nomads with no connection to country, nomads who are thought to speedily abandon land, to migrate away in the face of European settlement. So my first sort of response to the question that I said myself is this observation of this confusion. And we might want to remind ourselves, as I did in the beginning, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded. Okay, now, first cut, but that's not even the big cut you're in for. My second historical moment comes from Ghana country in the mid-19th century, about 70 years after Banks' statements from the House of Commons. Much of the Australian southeast has since been settled, and different from the colonies of New South Wales and Victoria, where big cities like Sydney or Melbourne were started on the basis of convict settlements. South Australia, where we are now, was always a state of free settlers and was regarded a place of religious freedom and progressive political reforms. I have a particular agenda and taking this opportunity to briefly share with you research that I've done on Prussian immigrant Moritz Richard Schomburg. I will briefly show you a contemporary publication on Schomburg that will get us to this question of settler colonialism. But there's another reason why I want to talk about Schomburg here in Potsdam, and that is because he's one of us here. And to an extent, that's quite amazing. Schomburg was the third of four brothers and began his career as a gardener, first in Merseburg and later exactly here on the palace grounds. Where he acquired basic knowledge in botany and chemistry, picked up practical skills such as grafting and the care of hothouse plants. His example lets us go to the role of the natural sciences in settlement, of agriculture and botany in the process that turns European migrants into settlers and that renders land as settled. This example, I'm using it here really also to remind us that the stories that I'm telling are not British colonialism, they're also about colonialism that started here. Schomburg's colonial career, if you will, began in 1840 when he joined his brother Robert, British government official, on an expedition to survey and fix the eastern and western boundaries of British Guiana, not Australia. He joined the expedition on behalf of the Prussian government with the order to collect new flora and fauna, as well as ethnographic specimens for the Berlin Botanic Garden and the Royal Museum. He was sponsored, of course, by none other than Humboldt. And back in Prussia, Schomburg and his brothers were linked to the 1848 reform movement. And he, like many of the 1848ers, left Europe and arrived at Adelaide in 1849 on what is quite in Australian history, a quite famous boat, the bark Princess Louise, an immigrant ship full of former German political, not revolutionaries, but progressives, right? Who wanted to go not to the States, because that place is already done, it's settled, it's decided. They want to go to a new place so they can have their democratic dream. They were professional business people with professional business training, artists, musicians, skilled craftsmen, and they settled in South Australia. Richard was still young then. This is at the end of his life, he's made it. He was not leaving for political reasons alone. Throughout the 19th century, German migrants who were trained in the natural sciences made their career in the British colonies, right? It gave them opportunities for research. Schomburg dealt commercially in plant specimen that he ordered from Europe, took the role of curator of a small natural history museum, and began to collect natural history as well as anthropological specimen for European institutions, for what is now the Berlin Museum of Natural History. His efforts gained him recognition as one of Adelaide's most prominent experts in agriculture, and he became the director of Adelaide's Botanic Gardens in 1865. Now, I'm sort of sharing this here to sort of talk briefly about the role of agricultural knowledge, of biological knowledge in the process of settlement. You know, farmers needed that knowledge to settle. And a botanic garden in that sense is not an innocent place of science in these colonies, but one where European plants are tested, you know, whether or not, does this grain work in this soil here? What do we need to do to grow this kind of wheat in this climate? At the same time, local plants are tested for their commercial use and prepared for export. The other reason why I briefly wanted to share Schomburg with you was because through people like him who traveled to other places like Australia long before German colonialism proper began, German-speaking journalists and others, intellectuals, began to sort of imagine a particular form of colonialism. After all, the British Empire was some sort of a role model for people. And the role accorded to German-born naturalists within the British colonies in this discourse is evident, for instance, from this essay. And I'm not sure we are German-speaking in this room, except Lena. Lena, can you read German? I've got an English translation. And I need to, again, fix my PowerPoint because it's not. Okay. Okay. So from this publication, Die Natur, from 1864, published by Otto Uhle, one of the Schomburg brothers' friends. From part of a series of essays where Uhle presents to the readers whom he calls pioneers of culture, so Germans who've migrated to the colonies. And he presents them as role models for what he imagines to be a German form of colonialism. So the quotes I'm giving you on my translation, they might be pretty bad nevertheless, right? We present to our readers a whole families of pioneers of culture. These we won't be seeing acting amongst the savages, fighting against barbarism and sowing the first seeds of civilization and humanizing sensations, taste, manners, and aspirations. This they won't do because that's what the British do, right? The British fight against barbarism and sow the first seeds of civilization. The country that they've devoted themselves to has, for a few unfortunate remainders, unfortunately already been stripped of its native population. And these remainders, i.e. local, indigenous people, caught in the process of accelerated decline will most probably not merit the attempt of civilizing them. Right? So this is not their job, dealing with indigenous peoples. You can ignore them, right? And it repeats the figure of thought that we saw in Cook and Banks. They'll vanish anyway. But here's what's interesting. The country itself is wild and is in need itself of being awakened from the state of savagery so as to become accepted as a legitimate member amongst the cultured nations and people of the world. What I want you to see is this, that it's actually a very similar figure of thought, right? People who were there before are gone. We don't even need to conceptually, intellectually, whatever, engage with them. Here's land and it needs to be settled, cultured. And that's the job that Uhle foresees for someone like Schomburg. And that's, I think how Schomburg understood his own work as well. He published a lot on plants in South Australia, on trees, on grains that can grow there. And he wrote about the disappearance, not of people, but of animals as cattle and grazing, grazing sheep and cattle sort of moved inland and the progress of civilization happened. So he sort of remarked that, these native animals are disappearing because our cattle sort of trample on their nests and whatever, but the country's being prepared for settlement. So he has this kind of naturalist sadness for disappearing, for extinction. At the same time, he regards it as a story of progress. I wanted to just briefly mention Schomburg here, as I said, to remind us that these stories, that this settler imaginary is not one that we exempt off, and even in places that are not German, were never German colonies, it was nevertheless part of the local German-speaking imaginary, Prussian imaginary at the time. And to share with you just an image from the Australian Archive in the Natural Museum, Berlin, where that kind of story was still waiting to be properly told, right? The writings of Schomburg and others sit there, and this is their card index, at the moment the only index that even gets you to these writings. Okay, this is the conceptual point. I promised. I'll take an empty cowboy. So I've given you 2 examples that were historical, and I now want to sort of in the second half, and it's shorter than a half, turn to what makes settler colonial invasion a structure, not an event. That is to say, the infrastructure, laws and policies of present-day settler colonial society build on that older history, and they're never complete. They pop up in unexpected places, I think. Take a breath, bear with me. I'll try and link these 2 sections. I want to focus on a particular historical moment in the early 2000s when Australia introduced a number of policy changes designed to make it harder for refugees to arrive in Australia. There are lots of these changes, and I'll just briefly list them to give you a sense, right? They comprise the mandatory detention of unauthorized arrivals, right, imprisonment, the limitation of judicial opportunities for judicial review of the decision, right? You can no longer, if you've been repelled, you cannot appeal. The introduction of temporary protection visas. If you were successful, you may stay in the country, but only for a couple of years, then you must leave. And in 2003, and faced with rising attempts to, of people to arrive, to reach Australia, we're talking about war in Afghanistan and other things, Australia decided to excise parts of its coastline from the migration zone. You might be familiar with this. This image shows the status quo in 2005, a bit later, but this process begins 2003, where they begin to say, people arrive from the north, anybody who arrives here, you've not arrived. We know this, right? Frontex does the same. I'm not sharing those stories to say they're particularly bad, they were just a bit earlier. So any arrivals on these islands up north, on the coast up north, does not count as having arrived on Australian soil. In 2013, that kind of imaginary was extended to the whole of Australia's coastline. So no matter where you step ashore from a boat, you have not arrived. So I'm not saying Europe's not doing the same. Right? I rather want to show how Australia's history of settlement that turned migrants into settlers and that denied sovereignty to original owners haunts discussions around this. And I will just be sharing with you 3 images from the early 2000s where we can see this kind of haunting. Our first image and a very early reaction came in October 2001 in the context of the Sydney Tactical Media Conference, when debates about refugees were very large on the horizon. September 11 had just happened and a large sort of boat had just arrived and people were in panic over refugees from Afghanistan. Giving a keynote address at that conference, Indigenous activist Rebecca Beer-Wingfield addressed the non-Indigenous audience members as boat people. And that became sort of the term of that conference. And when the conference sort of, on the closing night, what they did was they projected an image of a tall ship, like that kind of image, or that kind of image, onto Sydney's Opera House, together with the caption, boat people. There was no random choice of location. On the one hand, the Opera House is an icon of Australia. It sits right where settlement began on Bennelong Point. That is where the first convict steps ashore. That's also where a very famous Indigenous figure who acted as cultural translator between the British and the Gadigal people lived, Bennelong. So it sort of brought these 2 histories together. What are the associations that are generated by this combination, right? The slogan boat people and this particular image. This was not alone. Other statements that were made at the time and that continue to be made are statements like they should have done the same to Captain Cook, not letting him step ashore, or letting him step ashore, but he hasn't arrived, that kind of logic. And they suggest that there is a link between the settler colony past and the harsh policy responses to unauthorized arrivals. I'll share with you political cartoons. Here's one that shows Immigration Minister Philip Ruddock and a border guard who do more than merely prevent shipwreck refugees from crossing the beach. You will notice that the cartoon puts them, imagines them to be the 2 men opposed to the landing, right, that Cook describes. resolved to oppose the landing. As Cook's shipmate Sidney Parkinson recorded on the day, this is again 1770, on approaching the shore, two men made towards us, blah, 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 and they often cry to us, wara, wara, wai. The phrase spoken by the two men has since been translated as go away. So here's Ruddock usurping that position. So it seems, this is the argument of anthropologist Ghassan Haj, that the arrival of unauthorized migrants in the present recalls memories of the continent's early invasion by European settlers. It invokes an anxiety about how the nation was settled. Haj puts this in a beautiful long passage in one of his books where he goes, when we see people coming, we're always worried that they're going to steal the land from us. Why? Because we know this land can be stolen. We have done it ourselves, right? This is sort of what he reads into this whole discussion. Importantly, this extra level of anxiety, this haunting, is present across the political spectrum. It's also present in responses that are diametrically opposed to those of the government and of Ruddock. Here we have cartoonist Fiona Katauska's cartoon from the same time, and it's a figure that does something completely opposite, right? It goes, let me welcome you. But it's strikingly similar in composition. Both the other cartoon and this one show white people on the beach, on the coast, facing a boat intent on mooring. While the figure of Ruddock rejects the arrivals, Katauska's woman stands arms outstretched and extends a welcome. I said that at first sight, of course, they look very much opposed. The woman even stylizes herself as un-Australian, thereby marking her speaking position as fundamentally opposed to the kind of Australianness that Ruddock stands for. Nevertheless, they both occupy the role that the two men had in the first encounter on the beach. That is to say, in barring entry or in welcoming the boat ashore, they assert a position of ownership of the land from which they extend or deny hospitality. No matter what they do, their actions usurp a position of rightful ownership. They ignore prior indigenous claims to land. They deny sovereignty to those who were there before. Now, things are certainly complex. And the response of Australia's first people to refugee migration has also been varied, right? It's not, and people have asked, tried to sort of found that an interesting position to speak from in thinking about refugee migration. Some of the areas at the top end of Australia are Indigenous country, I guess officially Indigenous land, given back under native title jurisdiction. And some of these communities are outspoken supporters of Australia's border protection. Right? They're part of the troops who patrol the coast. From their perspectives, refugees too can be seen to participate in the ongoing settlement of Australia through migration. Having to protect the border can in this moment perform ownership and sovereignty. On the other hand, other groups and other individuals have argued and have performed an extension of hospitality to refugees also as an act of sovereignty. Right? The poem you read, maybe read in the beginning, comes from Indigenous poet, Melbourne poet Tony Birch, who has also argued in other contexts that an Indigenous claim to sovereignty must be exercised through ethical responsibility and hospitality towards people in need of protection. He says, Aboriginal people need to assert moral authority and ownership of this country. And I'm quoting him, we need to claim and legitimate our authority by speaking out for and protecting the right of others who live in or visit our country. Not to visit, not come to settle. Right, and where does that leave us? I hope to have conveyed that in a settler colonial situation that is unresolved, echoes or whatever impacts from the colonial past are acutely felt. I've spoken about how settler colonialism as an ongoing project, it imaginatively transforms colonial migrants into settlers, a project that continues to be challenged, that is unsettled, as settlers are reminded of their status as migrants, be it through Boer people or First People's claims to sovereignty of a country. Instead of a conclusion or a settlement of my talk, if you like, I would like to invite you to watch sequences from an evocative short film by Indigenous filmmaker Alison Page, commissioned by the National Museum of Australia, so a national institution, on the event of the 250th anniversary of Cook and the Endeavour's arrival in Australian waters, the very events that I've discussed with you at length. Alison Page created a film that revisited all of the first encounters described in Cook's journals, and she asked descendants of the first peoples who'd been involved in these encounters all along the East Coast to reenact these scenes for the film, with at least two important differences that you will see in a moment. First of all, Cook is ghostly. He only steps ashore briefly. He's evil. He's a haunting. Secondly, instead of focusing on the European story, the film shows Indigenous men running up the coast, warning all communities along the way of who is coming. The film ends with images of Possession Island. That is the very, it does say up there, Possession Island, at the very top end, that place where Cook, after many different instances of, leaving the inscriptions on the shore and hoisting that flag, does it one final time. And then claims possession, not of the continent, can't do that, Dutch have been there before, but of the whole of the East Coast for the British Crown. So the film also goes to that place. But in this film, the Endeavour never gets to land. The boat, we might say in this context, at least the context of my talk today, is shadowed, intercepted, and turned around, just as refugee boats are all along the Australian coastline these days. So instead of a land awaiting settlement, and instead of small groups ready to speedily abandon the country to the newcomers, the film shows First Peoples in the role of border patrol. Okay. So I will show these images. I've got nothing to say afterwards, so there'll be awkward silences. But I'll play sort of 3 minutes now, and then I'll play another 2, and I need to jump in between. Should work. So at the end of my talk. When I show a film like this, I'm nervous about how it will be read, right? Will this come across as exoticizing or like a reactionary fantasy of people who are defeated by history, you know, trying to imagine the past otherwise? Like one of those what ifs that quite often end up being very conservative in their imagination. I'd be happy to have a discussion about that, and I would have strong arguments why I don't think that is the case. But we don't need to go there. I hope you can enjoy the lecture and enjoy the suggestion that we might actually want to read such a video such as this one that is really about how does Australia remember Cook 250 years later. That it's always also about how Australia thinks immigration at the same time, at least when we put these two things side by side. I want to thank you for your hospitality here, and that's it.